All right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Rachel Denham, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Xerces Society. Today, we are joined by Mace Vaughan, who is the Pollinator Program Co-Director, also has lots of great experience with all sorts of different types of bees, including tickle bees, which he will be talking about along with other ground nesting bees today. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Mace, for being here. We are looking forward to your presentation, so I will pass it off to Mace. Thank you.
Awesome. Excellent. Thanks, Rachel. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining today. It's pretty exciting to, it's pretty exciting to tell stories about insects, stories about these animals that the Xerces Society spent time thinking about and working to protect just because of how important they are for the world, for us, intrinsically. Just because, frankly, they're pretty fun. So, as read, my name is Smith. I am the Pollinator Conservation Program Co-Director at Xerces. I also serve in a unique role as a partner biologist and conservation entomologist and collaborator with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, where we help farmers and ranchers all across the country to be able to support pollinators and beneficial insects and biodiversity on farms and ranches all over the US. And I've been doing this work for a while. I've been working for Xerces for almost 20 years, either as an entomologist or as a pollinator conservation director. My background is in a mix of natural resource management and entomology and beekeeping and teaching. So I really it's been fun for me at Xerces over the last couple of decades, being able to bring all those different skills together. Just a quick outline of where we're going to go over the next hour or so. I do, just for context, want to just quickly touch on the importance of pollinators and why is it that we are, focusing on insects, focusing on talking about these animals, talking about overall native bee diversity and biodiversity and their overall ecology, to give you sort of a framework for thinking about the variety of bees, of native bees there across the United States world. And then we'll dive into the story of the tickle bee and leave you all with thoughts on ground nesting, bee conservation, and some habitat ideas.
But before we do, I was curious to get a little bit of perspective from all of you, there it goes, on what you all know or whether or not you have heard of the tickle bees. So if you wouldn't mind, I just put a poll up onto your computers. Look at that. God, this polling is amazing. Look, all right, so a few of you, 20%, 25%, give it another minute here. Fantastic. Thank you all. Look at that. That's great. So before this webinar, only about a quarter of you had heard of tickle bees before. Okay, excellent. Well, when you all are done, you can become tickle bee apostles, so to speak. Oops, not that one. And let's do one more. Let's see here. Cancel that. I've got one more poll for you. Let's do this one. Out of curiosity, how many native bee species do you all think there are in the US? Tickle bees are just sort of one group. Okay, definitely noticing that this is an educated crowd. Ha! Oh, this is cool. I need to do more polling on my webinars. This is fantastic. All right, so we've got a mix here. It looks like groupthink is narrowing in on the right answer. But yes, there are about 3,600 bees species in the U.S., and several of them could be called tickle bees. It helps if I actually share the results. So yeah, there are 3,600 bees out there. So let's learn a little bit about them. This is great. Hold on. All right. Let's see here. So first of all, before I even dive in, I did want to say just that donors make our work possible, and just thank many of you are members. And we've got, it's been really fun for me, exciting to see the support that Xerces has had the privilege to receive over the years from members and foundations. We really can't do our work without our 12,000 members. We've got private foundations, scientists in 100 countries, scientists from universities across the world, federal agencies, state, local agencies support our work, hundreds of farmers and land managers we've worked with, 50 companies support our work, and just thousands of people who are just out there doing fantastic pollinator conservation, biodiversity conservation, freshwater mussel conservation, fireflies and dragonflies. It's really great, all the work that you all are doing, all the care that you all have for this important biodiversity on the ground. Yeah, it's an honor to be able to support the work that you all are interested in, and to be able to partner with so many different people. So before we dive in, just wanted to say thanks to all of you for joining, and thanks to all of our partners who really help make our work possible. And with that, I'm going to dive right in to talking about the importance of pollinators and why are we even spending time on this. First of all, it's important to know that 85% or more of flowering plants need an animal, mostly an insect, to be able to move pollen from one flower to the next or within a flower in order for that flower to set seed, to set fruit, to be as reproductively successful as possible. And when it comes, bees are really our most important pollinator. If we think about food that is insect pollinated, again, our bees and other pollinators are responsible for 35% of crop production worldwide. $18 to $27 billion worth of crops in the US is either totally or somewhat dependent upon pollinators in order to be most productive. This includes most of our vitamins and minerals, our fruits and vegetables. All of those plants, are either result directly from pollination, or need a pollinator to grow a seed, to produce seeds so that we can grow our carrots and our broccoli and things like that. And if we look at all of these different food products, scientists estimate that about 1 in 3 mouthfuls of the food and drink that we consume actually traces its way back to a pollinator. And that's everything from fruits and vegetables, but also oils like canola oil and sunflower oil. Not to mention dairy products that rely on alfalfa hay, and to grow alfalfa hay, you need alfalfa seed, and to produce alfalfa seed, you need to have a lot of strong pollinators out there doing that work. So a lot of our food can be traced back to the value of pollination. And we did this great experiment, oh my goodness, over a decade ago now, with Whole Foods Markets, where they took a store, I think in Providence, Rhode Island, in the middle of the night, put a few shoppers around shopping in the produce section, and then after that took all the insect pollinated produce out just to show the impact of before and after if we didn't have pollinators. A little bit later, they did the same thing in the dairy aisle. All the dairy products that have pollinator dependent products, like pollinator dependent fruits are in them, or just the dairy that's so important that traces its way back to alfalfa feed and other feed, just to show you how we just lose so much food if we don't have pollinators out there helping to pollinate our crops. The other thing too that I think is interesting to me is our pollinators are really important for wildlife and other diversity in the landscape. So those fruits and seeds that are produced by pollination are a major part of the diet of birds and mammals. Pollinators themselves are food for wildlife, including almost 90% of birds need an insect during at least one life stage in order to be most reproductively successful. So often those chicks need lots of caterpillars and grubs and other things to be feeding on. So I like to joke we're a conservation organization that really strives to get as many of our insects out there in the landscape and are then happy if other things come along and eat them. Pollinator habitat is also really compatible and supportive of the needs of other wildlife. When we create really strong pollinator habitat, it's a diversity of native plants, native wildflowers, trees, and shrubs. And by creating diverse structure, diversity in the native plant community, we're really supporting a whole range of wildlife, which to me makes this, even more interesting and more exciting. And when we think about pollinators, there are so many different groups of species that come to mind. The insects overall are the most important, and you've got butterflies and flies, moths, you've got wasps and beetles, but bees really, particularly in the temperate zones of the world, particularly say in the US, bees are our most important pollinator. And it's for a few really key reasons, which I think is important to keep in mind. Unlike almost all other insects, there are a few exceptions, but unlike almost all other insects that visit flowers, bees are actively collecting and moving pollen. They're feeding pollen to their young. They're gathering it to mix it with nectar to, you know, grow their offspring, to grow baby bees. And so they're really focused on the pollen, you know, producing structures of a flower, and therefore they're really, you know, moving a lot of pollen around. They also, you know, they forage around a nest site. So they've got a nest in which they're based, and they don't really move from that nest. And so if we can create a landscape that harbors a lot of bee nests, so beekeeping is the classic example. You know, you plop a hive down, and for the most part, those honeybees are going to stay in the area around that hive. Same with our native bees. If you've got bee nests in the ground that we're going to talk about, or in trees and other places, they're going to forage in that landscape around that nest. And finally, bees are not dumb. They actually, that tiny little brain right there, well, they actually have several little brains, really help them to, they can learn, they can figure out where the pollen and where the nectar is in a flower. And by doing that, it's more efficient for them to visit the same flower species over and over again, which is exactly what we want if you want to have good crop pollination, good pollination in your garden, or if you're a plant and you really want to set the most seed, you know, you want any flower visitors to like visit, you know, the same species of flower, the same plant species over and over again to move the pollen to the right place. And a lot of our other pollinators will do that. But bees are just the most efficient at it. You know, butterflies, they flit around. They're, you know, wasps are like, yeah, this is cool. But bees are just particularly focused on that behavior. So when it comes to bees, as we were just talking, as we were doing that initial poll, there are roughly 3,600 species in the United States. So there's a ton of diversity out there. And I love this photo from Steve Buckman from Arizona showing, you know, they range from these tiny, tiny little mining bees to these giant carpenter bees. We have just a huge range in size. And actually Xerces has a really nice fact sheet on our website, just a little one-pager kind of giving you a really high overview of just the variety of bees that are out there in the landscape. And it's a really nice just little handout to get a sense of that diversity. But let's walk through it here for a second. I mean, most people are familiar with honeybees, and I think most people know that, you know, they're a European, African, old world species that was brought to the US, so they're not native here, and they're really quite a bit different from all of our native species. Like no native bees in the US or Canada, you know, are kept in hives like this, produce honey, live year round, have tens of thousands of workers, produce honeycomb. That's a pretty unique set of behaviors. Our native bees are pretty different from this, as we'll learn here in a second. And when we think about bee diversity, I'm just going to walk you through, like this isn't the kind of webinar where we're going to learn about identifying, you know, Bombus von Smithsenskyii or, you know, some, you know, all these specific bee species. But I do want to walk you through the variety that's out there so you've got a sense of, if you haven't been watching bees before in your garden or your farms or your parks, just to give you a sense of what's out there. So we've got bumblebees. Most people recognize or are familiar with bumblebees. We've got mason bees that we'll learn a little bit more about here. We've got large carpenter bees. Here's a western species on the right and an eastern species on the left. We've got small carpenter bees that are tiny little bees that do the same, behave in the same way. We've got striped sweat bees. We've got green sweat bees. We've got green striped sweat bees. There's a whole variety there, and you got to admit these guys are pretty glorious. We've got longhorn bees, where the males in particular have these really long antennae that are pretty cute. We've got sunflower bees. We've got parasitic bees. We'll learn more about these guys a little bit later on. We've got leafcutter bees that, besides the tickle bees, I kind of have a soft spot for. I mean, these are charming, charismatic bees, carry their pollen on the bottom of their abdomen. They cut leaf pieces and fly them into their nest sites. This picture from Clay Bolt is amazing. They're very charismatic bees. But tickle bees are going to be what we're going to spend the most time talking about today, and we'll come back to that. So there's this tremendous variety of these 3,600 species. There's a whole variety of different bees out there, from tiny to big, to green, to purple, to striped, to not striped, just a real variety. But when we work with farmers, when we work with gardeners or land managers, as we're thinking about bee conservation, what's really nice is to take all those 3,600 species and break them down into 3 groups that really let us think about their ecology, that really let us think about how do we create habitat for them in a landscape. And I'm actually going to do these in reverse order. Usually I go from ground nesting solitary bees to bumblebees, but in this case, we're going to work backwards. We've got our social bumblebees, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. These are our classic social species with a queen and a number of workers. And then we have mostly solitary bees that either nest in tunnels, usually in wood, or our ground nesting species that we're going to focus on more today. But I do want to give you a sense of all 3 of these groups, because if we know the ecology, big picture of these different types of bees, it really helps us think about how do we create their habitat in our backyards or on our farms, ranches, parks, etc. So let's start with bumblebees. So they are, quite a bit different from honeybees, even though they're probably, more similar to honeybees than a lot of our native bees. In this case, we've got about 57 species in North America. They've got these social colonies that are founded by a single queen. For example, this lady right here. Their colonies only last for 1 season, a big difference from honeybees that tend to be perennial, carry over many seasons. And their nests maybe have 100 to 300, maybe more, but just a few hundred workers rather than many thousands or tens of thousands. And the basic life cycle they go through is, let's say we start with the winter. Bumblebee queens need a place to overwinter where they hunker down, someplace where they're protected from the extremes of the environment, and wait out the cold weather. They come out in the early spring, find a cavity in which to start a nest, and then that queen all by herself forages for pollen and nectar to bring back. Maybe she puts it in a little bucket like this, a little wax pot, and then generates a bunch of heat, tries to raise her first workers, and then sends the workers out to do all that work in the field. That colony grows throughout the growing season, throughout the warm months, and by the end of its life cycle, it's producing new queens here, and male bees, drones. They will mate, and then the male bees will die. The old queen dies, and all these newly mated queens go out, try to fatten themselves up on goldenrod or whatever late season plants are out there, and then find that nice spot to overwinter. So that's the basic life cycle of a bumblebee. And, they're going to find the nests that they're looking for are often abandoned rodent burrows. They're under lodged grasses, brush piles, unmowed areas, piles of leaf litter, even sometimes down in mouse holes or vole holes in lawns. Any place there's a small cavity in which to build a nest. And the queens overwinter under some sort of loose organic soil or duff or just loose organic matter that helps them basically crawl under a blanket where they can be protected from the elements for the winter. So those are our bumblebees. And if we think about those nest sites, as we think about overwintering sites, as we think about food, which we'll talk about at the end, pollen and nectar, we're able to help them. Solitary bees, so the rest of our bees are solitary species. And these are, our ground nesting bees and our tunnel nesting bees go through this different life cycle where, let's say at a particular time each year, the adult bees emerge, they mate, the females forage and build new nests. And in those nests, like this ground nesting bee here, they lay a ball of pollen and nectar, like we see here, put an egg on it, close up that nest, and do this again and again and again and again, as many times as they can. That egg hatches, feeds on that pollen and nectar, eventually grows, pupates, and becomes an adult that comes out usually, the same time next year. So they may be underground or hiding out for many months in their nests, kind of waiting for the right season to come up. Some species, interestingly, have more than one generation per year, but a lot of them just have, like our tickle bees, just have a single generation. Now, of those solitary bees, one moment, about 30% of them, and it's really roughly, if you think that we've got 57 bumblebees in North America, maybe 49, I always forget how many are just in the US. The bulk of the rest of those are mostly solitary species. And 30% of those nest in hollow or pithy plant stems, old beetle tunnels in wood, man-made cavities, even snail shells. And if we've got snags and brush piles or shrubs with pithy or hollow stems or bundles of hollow stems, you can have these bees nesting in all of those different landscapes. Like here's a small carpenter bee putting pollen and nectar into a cell that had a little partition right there. And if we look, here's a mason bee. They've got mud walls, that ball of pollen and nectar with the eggs on them, just to give you a sense of what's going on inside of that tunnel nest, just so you can see what that looks like. Interestingly, they put the males in the front and the females in the back. so that if a parasite or a bird or something comes along and tries to eat the bees in the nest, they just lose a few males, and that's not a big deal. Oh, they also, for tunnel nesting bees, they often need nesting materials. So leaf pieces, mud, sawdust, resins, like sap, plant fibers. Depending on the species, they have different things. So if you see a redbud leaf or rose petals or snowberry, there are a whole number of species where if you see these circles, circle, maybe a few ovals cut out, really consistent patterns like that, that's leaf cutter bee damage as they're cutting away those leaf pieces to take back to the nest. Like I said, I got a soft spot for leaf cutters too. They're pretty cool. But this brings us to the main topic for today, which are ground nesting solitary bees, and then we'll dive right into the tickle bees. So these critters go through that solitary life cycle, but they're building their nests underground. So when we're thinking about these and looking for these, my goal for this talk is that through all the pictures I'm about to show, you sort of develop a search image. So as you walk through your neighborhood, as you walk around town, through your parks or your natural areas, you've got a sense of what to look for, to kind of keep your eye out, to be able to notice something that until I got into bees in my early 20s, I had no idea were out there. I didn't notice any of these insects, and I'm sure they were all around as I was growing up. And I just never, I was never trained to look for them or to think about them. So of those solitary bees, 70%, the remaining 70% more or less, nest underground. From the top, they often look a bit like ant nests, maybe, with bigger holes. As you can see, here's a nest, and here are some nests here, there. These are a little bit harder to see, but here's a bee actually hovering in front. This looks more like little ant hills. They often can be found in turf, but they're more often probably in these bare, exposed ground. Thinking about south-facing slopes, really sunny sites that get a lot of sun exposure. Imagine you're a bee trying to find a spot that's a little bit drier, a little bit warmer. You're also going to be, ideally, most of our bees are looking for sandy to loamy soils that are a little bit better drained. I mean, some nest in clay too, but they're looking for warm, dry, overall well-drained soils that really help create an environment that's, kind of what you or I would want. Like, we don't like to be cold and damp. So, in this case, sometimes you find these down, maybe there's even some moss or on the ground, just a lot of different places. I found them often if I've got, this is the stone on a stone wall that I built many years ago at an old house that we used to have. And, in the clear dirt around it, I was able to find nests there. We've got a golf course outside of Portland, Oregon, where we're based, that has this lovely south-facing slope, which is full of these ground nesting agapostemon. These are these iridescent green sweat bees. But again, you've got this sort of nice, hold on, there it goes. A nice exposed, well-drained soil, doesn't grow a lot of vegetation. In this case, it's so well-drained, into which you've got these bees that are nesting. This is a picture on this is not as good as I like, but just a nice south-facing slope gives you a real sense. These are the sort of places where I keep my eyes peeled for bees. And even in a lawn, I mean, this is a lawn that Matthew Shepard, who works for the Xerces Society along with me, he and I were called out 15, 20 years ago, to this lawn that was full of these ground nesting bees. So even a lawn is someplace where you could find bees that are out there in the landscape. And this is just a nice set of pictures that Sarah Morris and our team and our staff took just of these bees, like of a little sweat bee digging her way out of the ground. So let's look underground for a moment to get a better sense of what's there too. Because in a way, how sometimes, at least I wish when I'm on a lake or the ocean, I could take all the water away just to see all the life that's there. Sometimes I wish we could do the same thing with soil. So our ground nesting bee nest can be anywhere from, several inches to a meter or more deep. You can see here's the tunnel. This is a nest that was excavated by some scientists in California. You can see the tunnel that goes down, 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 and then under the ground are these cells underground, which, into which the bees have planted these balls of pollen and nectar and laid eggs. They often smooth out the inside of these cells and line them with waxy gland secretions. Sometimes they're so well sealed, they can even be protected from flooding. This site here is actually under a vernal pool in California that floods all winter long. And as the waters recede, wildflowers bloom as the edge of the water recedes, and out from the ground come these mining bees that are then foraging on, visiting the flowers that are blooming in the vernal pool. It's a pretty cool system. But you can see here's a tunnel down to some cells. The structure of that varies, like the architecture of that underground nest varies from species to species. Sometimes it's just a single tube that drops down with little cells that come off of it. Interestingly, some of these kind of corkscrew around, which is kind of cool. They can just be, you know, rooted structures that go out in a whole bunch of different ways. Sometimes it's just a single cell, like a single tunnel that comes in with bees, you know, planted, so to speak, all along it. Here you've got bees that are just packed together, more than one per cell, or just like a little rooted mass. I don't know, I just think it's cool that each species kind of has its own way of building a nest underground. And sometimes these nests become exposed. We were hiking in Southern California this winter, and, you know, along the trail came upon this spot that had this old bee nest, the ground nesting solitary bee nests that were exposed. You could still see the inside of some of these cells and how smooth they are. And it was just fascinating to see this cut bank and just how many tunnels and cells were packed in here from a bee nesting aggregation that must have lasted for several years. All right, well, that brings us to the tickle bees and the story of how they were discovered and named. So I actually, in fact, it's sort of fun. This is really fun for me because usually I do my webinars at the office, and because of all the stay-at-home pandemic issues, I'm actually been working from home, and I am sitting here in our living room at my desk staring out at this field that you see right here. And when my daughter started at this school, Sabin Elementary School in Northeast Portland, Oregon, when the parents of her friends found out what I did, everyone asked, "Oh, you must know about the tickle bees. Have you ever heard of the tickle bees?" And I had no idea what they were talking about. This went on for months. Every time somebody found out that I worked with bees or did bee conservation, they're like, "Oh, do you know about the tickle bees, tickle bees, tickle bees?" So come St. Patrick's Day that year, and this is about maybe in 2009, all of a sudden I'm working at home one day and I look across the street and the kids are out for recess, and there are all these kids on their hands and knees in the middle of the field. And at that point, everything clicked, and I knew exactly what the tickle bees were. So I went across, I waited for the kids to go inside because it's recess, and I didn't want to, you know, I didn't want to be that creepy dad showing up on the school. Waited until the kids went inside, and I went out there, and all across the field were all of these little mounds of dirt that you can see as little dark spots on this picture and a little bit more clearly in this picture. And I looked more closely and saw these little mounds of dirt, and I waited all of 2 seconds to see these bees coming in, and all of a sudden I totally understood that's what the tickle bees are. And so these kids in the years before we ever moved into this house and before my daughter went to this school, they had named these bees the tickle bees. Now these are mining bees, bees in the genus Andrena. And there are a couple of species out there, and I'm embarrassed to say I had them identified, and I couldn't track down that information. So I'm a little embarrassed to say I don't have the species name, but there are at least 2 species of Andrena mining bees that the kids would call the tickle bees across the street. And when they come out, the kids go crazy. They're picking them up, they're checking them out, they're rolling around. We had some field days. My little buddy Cosmo here would be swinging a net and trying to catch them. They were, it's quite amazing. So what I want to do here is to give you a sense of this, and Rachel, you have to tell me if this works all right. I wanted to give you all a sense of what those kids were seeing, what I was seeing when we went across the street. So I'm playing a video here. The exposure is not great, but because of the angle of the light, you can see it reflecting off the bee wings. And as you look at this field, you can see there are thousands of bees flying in and around this field. You can see them. It's just like dust in the air, bees flying everywhere. And Rachel, can you just chime in? Tell me, how is that looking?
It's breaking up a lot, so I think if you play it again like we did in practice, it might be a little bit smoother. You can see them a little bit better now. All the white dots are the bees.
All right, let me give it a shot. Thank you for that. We're just going to do a replay here. All right, playing it again. See if you can get a sense of that. I hope it comes through okay, because it's pretty dramatic. There are just a lot of bees over the ground. Is it any better that second time?
Not super well, but I know towards the end of the video it was easier last time we looked at it, so.
All right, we'll give it a shot here till the end. Well, hopefully that came through okay, and hopefully, depending on your computer. Oh, look at that. Yeah, it's sort of glitching. Even I'm sort of glitching over there. Interesting.
You can see them in this last frame. All of those white, specks are the bee's wings, so.
Yeah, and if I drag this around, you can sort of get a sense of it. I'll play the last little bit again. Now, the interesting thing, so when you have a large nesting aggregation like this, these are actually probably a lot of male bees that are flying around trying to look for females. The male bees will also do this other really kind of, actually here, this may be a little bit better. This is a tickle bee here. And again, Rachel, you have to let me know if the quality is okay. I'm trying video on, this is the first time I've tried video on a webinar. We're tracking this bee. She's in the, actually, I think it's a boy, but we'll go with it. He's in the grass right up here. He's hunkered around. He's looking for a nest, his nest to go find, to get back to. He's back up here. My cursor's going. He's crawling around in the grass. We're going to get closer in a second. There we go. Getting a little bit closer. There he is, hunkered down in there, looking for his nest. I think he's having a hard time because I'm standing there. And then, boom, found it. There it is. There's his nest hidden down in the grass. Comes back out, says, good, got the right spot. This is great. And he's going to head back out. So that's, so you can get a sense of what's going on in the ground there with these nests kind of hunkered down, hidden in the grass. And yeah, with thousands of bees doing that. What's interesting is the males sometimes will gather, and you may have noticed this in your neighborhoods if you have a tree that stands out or a shrub with a sunny spot and you've got a lot of tickle bees or a big aggregation like this of ground nesting bees nearby. I'm slowly painting the camera up to look into this maple tree. And as we get up and looking more and more vertically, you begin to see there are hundreds, if not thousands of bees flying around in this tree. And Rachel, do you want to let me know on this one too? Like, are you able to see those at all?
Yeah, this one, you can see them pretty well.
Excellent. And I'm going to zoom up a little bit closer so you can get a sense of just the whole, that there'll be these places where the male bees gather almost like they're lekking, males gathering together, and then the females will maybe come into that lek and then they'll have a place to mate. Oh, and then here's my daughter, this was years ago, very proud of her tickle bee that she's caught, holding it carefully by the wings, well done. And you can see, yeah, she's like, there it is. And then at the end, she's like, yeah, now let me see what I just did. Oh, it's so cute. And that's Gus the guinea pig, just so you guys know. Gus was a frequent visitor to that field. One more thing, just to get a close-up, because I can zoom in here, just to get a sense, like just the hundreds of bees that are up there, all these male bees gathering. Some of them are females foraging on the maple flowers, but a lot of these are just males that are gathering together, holding, like maybe holding some territory up here. I don't know. It's pretty amazing. And you'll see this, like I said, around shrubs, anything that sort of stands out in the landscape. You might see this in your neighborhoods. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's pretty amazing. All right, let's see here. Oops, bring my cursor back. Give me a second. All right, let's get back into the presentation. So that gives you a sense of what's out there. And one of the things that was, oops, hold on, I'm just trying to get rid of that. Okay, so obviously these kids are totally into tickle bees. They love to grab them and play with them. Actually, for the last several years, I've gone into the third grade classroom because the third graders were really worried about the kindergartners because the kindergartners were creating tickle bee hospitals. And to put a bee in a hospital, they would pull off a wing or smash them a little bit. And the third graders were incensed and wanted to explain to the kindergartners that these aren't just playthings, that these are, important animals. So I would go train the third graders who could then go to the kindergarten classes and explain that we don't make tickle bee hospitals. There's an important reason to not make a tickle bee hospital because it's, on the one hand, picking up these bees carefully by the wings, like my daughter's doing here, if you're able to do that carefully, you can do it. You can do it without hurting the bees and without getting stung. I mean, these bees don't sting. I mean, this is a male bee right here, actually, so it definitely doesn't sting because only female bees have a stinger. But even in the case of tickle bees, they don't use it. And our solitary bees in general, if you kneel in that nesting aggregation, it's perfectly safe. All those bees, those thousands of bees we saw, like kids don't get stung by those bees. So a lot of schools over the years have gotten in touch about these different bees. In fact, the principal here was worried, should I be worried about these tickle bees? And no, the tickle bees are fine. Like, they're called tickle bees for a reason. But it's important to discourage picking these bees up because over the years, I've had kids bring me honeybees. I'm like, let me just take that honeybee. You know, because they're just, like, it's hard. You have to make sure they know that not every bee is a tickle bee. If you grab a honeybee, if you grab a bumblebee, you know, you're going to get stung. You're not going to get stung by the bees nesting in the field, but if there's some flowers out there and you're just grabbing whatever bee you see, yeah, bees are safe at flowers if you don't grab them. And there are also bees like these little sweat bees that look a lot like a tickle bee. And there aren't really, they come out a little bit later in the season. But again, you know, you just want to discourage, those are bees that probably they have the potential to, if you grab them and hold on to them, have the potential to sting. So I think it's important to discourage picking them up, as much fun, frankly, as it is, just because you want to make sure you're actually grabbing a tickle bee. So that's part of what's going on out there in the field. But interestingly, one thing that's been happening is that the kids also started asking me questions about the red bees. And I was like, the red bees, what are those? So I started looking more closely and discovered that, oh, in this field are the tickle bees Nemesis. There are a couple of species of nomada, what the kids call the red bees. These are actually, they're bees. It's a type of bee, but they're a parasitic bee. They're a nest parasite, a cuckoo bee. They're a bee that waits for that female to leave the nest to go gather pollen and nectar, and they rush in and they lay their egg inside the nest where that bee is putting that ball of pollen and nectar. And then their eggs will hatch out and either eat the egg or eat the larva bee that's in there and eat that whole mass of pollen and nectar. And as a result, all of a sudden, like, instead of producing tickle bees, those nests start producing red bees. And it's been sort of interesting. My field here of like 20, 30,000 tickle bees has slowly been shifting to have more and more of the red bees. Now, don't get me wrong, as an entomologist and a conservationist, I kind of, you know, the red bees are cool. They're part of nature, part of diversity. But I have to admit, it's a little, I wish that it seems every year there are just a few more of our nomada, a few more of these red bees out there. And I kind of want the tickle bees to, I don't know, strike back a little bit. Call me biased, but that's okay. And interestingly, these bees will do that same lekking behavior. Like, I've got a shrub right here in the corner of our house, and on a sunny afternoon around, you know, after St. Patrick's Day, usually throughout April, I'll see, you know, dozens of these guys flying around looking for mates. The other thing that comes up, one moment, often is people, they're worried about stinging. And as I said, the tickle bees over here are gentle. They don't sting. Like, you could literally grab them. You certainly can kneel in the middle of a nesting aggregation, the whole giant nesting site like we have across the street, and not worry about getting stung. But people, you know, think, oh, but don't wasps nest in the ground too? And yes, there are a lot of ground nesting yellow jackets, ground nesting wasps. And a couple of things to look for is they look pretty different. You know, wasps stand out with these distinct, often yellow and black stripes. What you'll find with wasp nest is you've got a single entrance with a lot of wasps flying out. By the time that nest becomes really defensive and one where getting too close to it might lead you getting stung, there are going to be wasps flying in and out, in and out, in and out of that same hole. Whereas with the tickle bees, you know, it's just one female, for the most part, one female per hole. You don't see that level of activity. You just see a lot of nests, a lot of holes maybe spread out on a hillside or a lawn. And so those are two important things to look for. You know, bumblebee nests too are going to have usually a single entrance with a lot of bumblebees going in and out. And you want to stay away from those nest entrances. Like, you know, ideally they're not close to where people are walking. But yeah, you know, again, if you've got a field full of tickle bees, you're in good shape. So with that, as we sort of head to the home stretch here, I want to leave you with some thoughts on how do we think about conserving ground nesting bees? And particularly, let's focus on, let's say, the tickle bees here. And, you know, for all of those bees, all that diversity we've talked about, they need abundant pollen and nectar. They need plants that actually have been demonstrated to be plants that provide nectar and pollen that bees and other pollinators use. And because of the different types of solitary bees that come out at different times of year, in the springtime like tickle bees or mason bees, or the summertime like squash bees and sunflower bees, or bumblebees that are active year-round, or even honeybees that are active year-round, we need to ideally have bloom for all those bees throughout the year. And in a garden setting, blocks of flowers are more attractive, and in general, native flowers tend to support greater native biodiversity. You know, but if you want to throw a little lavender in, I'm not going to hold that against you at all. But when it comes to our tickle bees, we're really going to focus on these early plants, things like Oregon grape or willow, you know, blueberries and huckleberries or lupins. These plants that are blooming early in the springtime are going to be really important for those spring emerging bees. And if we focus more, if we put even more attention on our tickle bees, you know, that early bloom is critical. And willow is a great plant. Pussy willow is really fantastic. But what I'm asking everybody all across, you know, the world to do is to ask their nurseries to set apart male plants from female plants. Because willows are dioecious, they have male and female plants, and the male plants are the ones that produce all this amazing pollen that the tickle bees are going to get into and that are critical for all these other bees. So those male pollen producing plants that really pack a punch. So if we can plant male pussy willow, that's a great thing to have out there for tickle bees. And depending on where you are in the country, everything from spring beauty and golden Alexanders to maple trees and tree fruits like cherries and apples, plums and pears. All of those spring blooming plants are going to be species that are really going to be providing extra benefit for our tickle bees and those other spring emerging solitary bees. The other thing, of course, is to be alert for those nest sites. I showed those pictures earlier of different slopes and south-facing areas and open soil. I think looking for these holes, looking for tunnels, just keeping your eyes on the ground as you move around, particularly in the spring, but even throughout the summer, looking for nesting aggregations or even individual nest sites. This is part of what we need to do. And this is part of what you can do to try to find where these are and then protect those nests. Recognize, oh, cool, all right, in this lawn or this side of a hill, we've got bee nests. I will say, there's no guarantees, but I have experimented with creating small mounds or berms of soil in the full sun. Actually, at our old house, this wall right here above it with a little berm about a foot high and 2 or 3 feet wide that I planted a hedgerow in. And, you know, over the years, I had bees nesting in that berm. It's mounded up, it's a little drier. It was a site that seemed pretty good. They also liked the soil right at the base of the rocks that were holding it up. I cleared away like a little patch in our front yard, pulled all the vegetation out to expose the soil. And fascinatingly, it didn't have tickle bees moved in, but I remember drinking beer one night on the front porch, just looking out over this ground that I just weeded to plant some flowers in. And all of a sudden there were dozens of sweat bees, little sweat bees that had decided that this was the spot where they were going to dig into to make a new nest, to make new nests in the ground. So I thought that was pretty cool. If you've got a lawn that's developed over the years, a really dense thatch, like, yeah, the kind of lawn that your grandfather would have made you go out to de-thatch, at least if you were in my family, which is kind of a thankless job, and take some of that thatch out, try to expose some soil in that lawn, because a lot of those pictures we saw, there wasn't a dense thatch layer of dead grass that had built up. I mean, it was pretty much grass and then exposed soil underneath it. That helps too, I think, and you could try to do that and see if you can get bees to come in. And like I mentioned a couple times, rock piles or walls create maybe drier, warmer areas in which you might have bees nesting. I've seen, you know, vertical rock walls that have access to the soil, so not super tight rock walls, just kind of loose rock walls. And, you know, again, you've got a well-drained site. It's warm, exposed, the rocks shelter it from some of the rain maybe and also hold on to some water. I don't know. It's all worth trying and just sort of seeing what you and keeping your eyes open. I say play around and have a good time. Can't hurt. And then, of course, where you've got this habitat, you need to protect it from insecticide exposure. Like these chemicals that are used to treat, say, plant pests or whatnot, if they get into those flowers, if they hit those nest sites, if they get onto those bees, I mean, as you can imagine, those insecticides are going to kill those bees. And so we need to, when we find those nests, we want to do what we can to protect those areas, those lawns from having any insecticides applied to them. So we can have that bee-friendly garden in that pesticide-free zone. So with that, we're going to head to questions here in a second, but I just want to say, one thing that Xerces has done for years and really prided itself on is pulling together resources that help landowners that are managing all different types of landscapes, from gardens to farms to natural areas to parks, to have the resources they need and the perspective to help them think about pollinator conservation. So we put together written many books over the years on native pollinators, or plants to feed the bees, or gardening for butterflies, or native beneficial insects. So we've got books that are available online, a ton of resources that are available from our website. If you've got any landscape that you're curious about, you could write in gardens, pollinators, Xerces, and find things, or go to our website and search through it and get all sorts of materials, on creating good habitat, great habitat, or managing habitat in your landscape. Rachel has been curating a fantastic YouTube site. I encourage all of you to subscribe and share it with your friends. There are all sorts of webinars, trainings, all sorts of videos that our staff have put together or participated in over the years. It's just fantastic. I actually went to it the other day and was like, oh my God, we've got so much on here. It's amazing. And then you can follow us on social media, on the Facebook, the Twitter, the Instagram. You can look for all those fun things out there to kind of keep track of all the stuff we're doing. We put out regular blogs about our work, so you can learn more about all the great stuff that our team is doing. Like, we've got amazing staff that are doing amazing work. So with that, we're going to move to questions here in a second. I just want to thank you so much. I want to thank you for your interest and for what you're doing to create pollinator habitat and to support habitat on the ground and help these bees. And also, as a reminder, Rachel will probably remind you too, we've got a little survey to help us understand how we can make these webinars more relevant, better run, better for you all. We really want to do what we can to serve your needs and interests, as we go forward. With that, Rachel, how about we turn it over to some questions? We've got about 10 minutes.
All right, thank you, Mace. We have a lot of really good questions. So the first one, someone said that they took out a large shrub and then found 3 to 5 burrows of ground nesting bees underneath where it was. Should they try to shade it again, leave it alone? Is there anything that they can do to protect the bees?
What I would do if you want to give it a shot, I don't think you need to shade it again or do anything like that. If you can sort of gather that soil together, if there's a way to kind of hold it together, and maybe even, kind of rebury those nests, maybe even kind of shallowly. Those bees are really strong diggers, and if the soil isn't too compacted, like usually they would follow up, the soil falls into their nest tunnels, and they can kind of dig their way through that. But even in this case, I think if you just kind of gently pack it together, there's a good chance that next year they'll be able to dig their way out, and then either maybe nest in the same spot, maybe just find a spot nearby. But I think even if you just did that, you'll probably be fine.
All right, another question. Is it possible to add a thick layer of sandy or loamy soil to a south slope of clay to attract the ground nesting bees?
We've thought about that for years. I've had people there are folks in Pennsylvania who put out big piles of sort of loamy, sandy soil to try to do that and had some success. I think it's probably not worth it. I think it would be a lot of work, and I think the chance of it being successful is pretty low. Certainly in a lot of new playgrounds, when they put down really sandy soil, you'll have things like, you'll have sand wasps that nest there, which sound ferocious, but they're actually quite gentle. They're a solitary wasp, and like solitary bees, they're pretty docile creatures. And you might get some of those in there, but I think I'm inclined to think if you've got a nice south-facing slope, first to spend some time watching it, you might actually have bees there already. It's a great question.
So a follow-up question, does mole activity attract solitary bees?
I don't think so. It might, and those mole holes, there might be cavities that get left behind that bumblebees potentially might move into. But I don't feel like when you see those mounds of soil that the moles put out, maybe that helps, but it's so loose. I feel like it's loose, it's above the ground, it maybe even gets wetter than it would if it was attached to the ground or holds water for longer if it gets rained on. I don't think it's joined enough. Like, those bees need to dig into soil that is well solidified so that it doesn't collapse on their nests. So my inclination is no, I don't think those mole holes or those piles of soil do anything to help bees. But maybe the tunnel for bumblebees later is possible.
So we have a question about location. Are tickle bees found in Georgia? And this is a good question for where tickle bees live throughout the United States, I guess.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we've had people call in from North Carolina, from New Jersey. You know, I used to watch nests when I was a student at Cornell University in upstate New York. I think these ground nesting mining bees in the genus Andrina can build these aggregations in, you know, decent size in most places across the country. So yes, Georgia, I'm sure, has large aggregations of ground nesting bees that are out there.
And some good questions here. So tunnels, if they do last several years, do bees use the same tunnels year to year?
I think, you know, it's interesting. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure they do. In that a lot of our ground nesting bees, some of those tunnels actually, no, and I take it back, I am confident they do reuse those holes because it's more efficient. They'll come back, and some of those tunnels can be pretty deep, deeper than you might expect a bee to be able to excavate in just a single, you know, 4-week or 8-week, you know, adult growing season. There are some bees, ground nesting bees in the Southwest deserts that have tunnels that go down a couple of meters. And so, yeah, I mean, they will reuse those tunnels, just more efficient. And yeah, they're able to keep using the same ones.
Okay. Fielding so many good questions. This one
This is great.
For those bees that lay their eggs in a linear pattern type nest, do the females in the back incubate longer than the males in the front? And do they all hatch in the same day?
Oh my God. Oh, and so, well, let's see. So maybe that's probably thinking about that from the tunnel nesting example I gave, you know, with those bamboo tubes. Those eggs, for a lot of those species, those eggs are laid and the eggs hatch and consume that pollen and nectar over the course of several weeks. And so let's say they lay those eggs in April. By middle of May to end of May, they've maybe done, for the most part, growing. And then there are many months when they are kind of dormant in that nest. So I don't know about the timing at which they feed. Probably the females are larger. It probably takes them a little bit longer to eat all of that pollen and nectar to grow to that larger size. But they spend so many months kind of hunkered down waiting for the right time next year that typically then what happens is the males emerge first and kind of set up territories, or they end up, you know, flying around the nest sites waiting for the females to emerge. And then at that point, just a little bit later, you find that the female bees, whether they're ground nesting or tunnel nesting, come out. So the male bees tend to come out a little bit sooner in a way to kind of get ready to mate, like, all right, ready to go. And then the females come out just a little bit later.
All right, this is an interesting question. What is being done when they are found in a public park, ball field, or heavily used sports field? Does this impact their nests?
You know, so part of the reason I think that this field across the street has so many bees in it is because it gets used for recess, you know, 4 times a day, every day, all season long. It's meant that the field has gotten a ton of, you know, it's a little bit compacted on the surface, so the soil holds together well. There's a lot of exposed areas. Even where there is grass, you can get down to the soil. In a way, I think that activity has helped. My bigger worry is when sports fields are then amended, you know, a ton of whatever amendments are added to try to make them a little better drained or this or that. Like, this is a field that has been leveled since we lived here, but only working the top layer, like the top inch or so of the soil, and the bees have just fine. But I think if you were to go through and really manage it as a ball field, and, you know, put down ground up, you know, sort of rock material and things like that to make it better drained, I do think, you know, a field that has bees in it could, you know, lead to a condition that's not as good. But for the most part, you know, a ton of kids running around on it seems to be okay. And even when they're active, I mean, it's hilarious. The poor people let their dogs play over there, and the dogs are getting all these bees in their face because their heads are right down there where there are thousands of bees are. But even then, when they're active, you know, bees get stepped on for sure. But the nesting aggregation has persisted for the whole 12 years we've lived here.
How would you preserve, or how would preservation's efforts differ in dry, harsh, high desert, which is very different from here in Oregon?
I think in a way some of the same principles apply. If we can find where those nests are, those ground nesting bees, just being able to identify those nest sites, recognize their value, recognize them for what they are, and prevent them from getting dug up, planted over too densely, whatever, flooded out, whatever it might be. The same principle applies, like trying to find where they are and then to protect those. I actually think it's pretty similar. And interestingly, in our high dry deserts, we actually have more bee diversity. There are more bees in the Southwest deserts, for example, or the dry areas of Eastern Oregon, for example, in Eastern Washington than there are on the west side of the Cascades or the wetter parts. So in a lot of ways, there are a lot more bees to be looking out, a lot more species, I should say, to be looking out for in a lot of our drier environments.
Perfect. So right at about time, Mace, if you want, we can go a little bit over, or we can end right at 11.
I'm fine going a little bit longer. If people want to stick around, if people need to go.
Perfect. Yeah, if you need to take off, feel free. There's just so many good questions that are here. So this one is interesting. Are late winter, early spring prescribed burns hazardous to ground nesting bees, or are they still dormant in that time?
Certainly late winter is going to be fine. That's a great question. You're right. Like if you had a big nesting aggregation somehow in a prairie and, you ran a burn through it, that would probably be bad if that was happening at the same time. But two things come to mind. One is I feel like late winter burns, for example, happen before it gets to reach about, say 70 degrees, plus or minus. Like here, it seems like we need to have really sunny days at 70 degrees-ish, give or plus or minus, after St. Patrick's Day, so after mid-March. That's when these bees begin to emerge. So if it's cold for all the way until early April, it won't be till it's warmed up. So that's one thing to think about. It does need to be, at least here with these bees, hit that 70-degree sunny mark. But so it takes a while for them to get enough heat units to be up, out, and running. So that's something that probably is protective. Also, sort of a burn.
Oh, Mace, we lost you.
How about that? Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. I was maybe shaking my head too much, getting too excited. In a prairie site where you might, I think you're probably going to find ground nesting bees in thinner, in soils that are better drained where the vegetation might be less dense. So it's possible too that where you've got more ground nesting bees, you might have less vegetation and therefore a cooler burn, or maybe it doesn't even carry a burn. So at least over the nesting site, you might not have as much damage where bees are flying in and out of their nests. I don't know that for sure, but it might be something. My guess though is that the burns would happen before it was warm enough for a lot of those bees to be out.
Okay, I like this question because I think it's really important to answer. Can you purchase ground nesting bees to get them started in your yard like you can purchase mason bees?
The short answer is no. For the most part, the short answer is no. It might be sort of, I've toyed with the idea, like where there's been we had a neighbor, for example, who was doing some landscaping, was going to end up digging out a bunch of ground nesting bees. And I thought, well, what if I grab a big plug of this and try to move it over? And I wasn't able to really get that experiment to work. The one real exception to this are alkali bees, which are used in Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, a little bit in Idaho, where you can actually create, for that species, we know how to create the perfect bed, the perfect ground nest site. And you can actually artificially create that ground nest site and bring big plugs of soil, maybe like a cubic foot, and seed it with alkali bees and actually get new nesting aggregations there. And they would use those to pollinate alfalfa seed, for example, in the mile or so around those nesting aggregations. And they're actually managed almost as a community resource. It's a pretty cool system that does just what you're talking about. But for your home or garden, no, there's not that sort of ability to purchase things. And we also, Xerces, we're kind of nervous about some of those purchases just because we're worried about buying bees that might have disease in them and then maybe spreading disease around, or buying bees that aren't appropriate for where you live, that aren't maybe native there, and bringing species in that either aren't adapted or shouldn't be there or whatever. I think, again, better to be looking for those sites that are out there, or thinking about your lawn and what's south facing, and maybe where can you be looking for bees, and trying to encourage those ground nests where close to where you live.
This is an interesting thought. Can you pre-start burrows for ground nesting bees by poking small holes into the ground with a pencil, or is that something that they may not need?
I'm going to be blunt. I have no idea. I say if you've got a spot, maybe a rock, south-facing slope, kind of dry, vegetation's already a little sparse. I don't know, stick some pencils in the ground and see what happens. I'm going to guess probably not, but it also would only take you a couple minutes, and it might be sort of a fun experiment. And then you could email our Pollinator program at pollinator@xerces.org and let us know if it worked. I would love it if it did. That'd be pretty fun. I think, though, as a quick follow-up, the success will depend upon all those other characteristics. Is it dry enough? Is the soil right? Are there bees around? But still, why not? Give it a shot. That can't hurt.
Awesome. So we're going to end on this question. And before we do end, is there an email address that people can send questions that we're not able to answer today to?
Yes. I mean, we want to help as many people as possible. And so you could send an email to our, the email I put up on the website, on the screen right now, pollinator@xerces.org. We want to help, but also we've just got, one person who's fielding those, for the most part, just one person who's fielding those questions and emails, but we'll do what we can to answer your questions. We really do want to help you out, but it's also, if we get 1,000 questions, might be hard, but we'll do our best to help you out, and certainly point you to resources. If you've got follow-up questions, we want to do everything that we're capable of to help you out. So we would do our best, and that would be the place to go.
Good call. My Q&A was covering that up, so I apologize. I totally did not see that. The last question we have is the name Tickle Bee, was that from Oregon?
The only place I have heard that are from the students here at Sabin Elementary School in Northeast Portland. But what I told those kids 10 years ago is that, hey, I was going to do everything I could to tell the world about Tickle Bees and help share their story with people. And so if schools all across the country have got, nesting aggregations like this that the kids have noticed and that they think are fun, and want to call them Tickle Bees too, I think it's a name that we should spread around. And I think it gives bees I think it's a good name for these bees.
I think it is too. It's very fitting. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Mace, and for answering all those questions. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Rachel. And thanks everybody for joining in. It's just a real honor, a real pleasure.